What happens when one of television's most beloved hosts faces off against a guest who refuses to play by the rules? In just 36 seconds, a single comment would shatter the carefully crafted atmosphere of one of Britain's most watched chat shows and send shockwaves through the studio audience. The stage was set like any other evening. The iconic red chair sat ready, the audience buzzed with anticipation, and Graham Norton prepared to welcome his next guest with his trademark warmth and wit. But nothing could have prepared him, or anyone watching, for what was about to unfold. She walked out to polite applause, settling into the chair with an air of confidence that immediately felt different from the usual guest. Where most celebrities arrive ready to laugh, share stories, and enjoy the banter, there was something colder in her demeanor, something that suggested this interview might not go the way anyone expected. Graham opened with his usual charm. "Welcome, welcome. So lovely to have you here. We've been so looking forward to this." Her response came sharp and quick. "I'm sure you have. I imagine the ratings will be quite good tonight." The audience laughed nervously, unsure if this was playful sarcasm or something else entirely. Graham, ever the professional, smiled through it. "Well, we always hope people tune in. Now, you've had quite the year. Tell us what you've been up to." She leaned back in the chair, her posture rigid. "I've been navigating a world that seems determined to misunderstand me at every turn. But I suppose that's what happens when you challenge the status quo." Graham's eyebrows lifted slightly. He glanced at his notes, then back at her. "Right. Well, I think a lot of people admire that about you. Speaking of which, your recent project has gotten quite a bit of attention. Not all of it fair attention, though, is it, Graham?" She cut him off before he could continue. "The media has a way of twisting narratives to suit their own agendas. I'm sure you understand that, being part of that media yourself." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Graham maintained his smile, but those watching closely could see the slight tension in his shoulders. "Well, I like to think we're here to have a good time and let people share their stories authentically." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Authentically? That's an interesting word choice. How authentic can anything be when it's edited and packaged for entertainment?" The other guests on the couch, two well-known actors who had been scheduled to appear alongside her, shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the playful back and forth that usually characterized the show. This was something else. Graham tried to steer things back on course. "I promise you, we're not here to twist anything. We just want to hear from you. Your fans want to know what's next for you." "My fans?" she repeated, her tone sharp. "Yes, let's talk about them. The people who actually support me. Unlike certain institutions that shall remain nameless, but everyone knows exactly who I'm talking about." The audience fell silent. This wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. This was heading into territory that made everyone watching feel like they were witnessing something they shouldn't be. Graham cleared his throat. End quote. "I think we can all appreciate that you've had challenges, but perhaps we could talk about some of the positive things? Your work, your projects?" She turned to face him directly, her eyes narrowing. "Positive things? You want me to sit here and pretend everything is wonderful?" "That's exactly the problem, Graham. Everyone wants me to smile and be grateful and never speak about the reality of my experience." "I'm not asking you to pretend anything," Graham replied, his voice remaining calm but firm. "I'm simply suggesting that our audience might enjoy hearing about what you're working on. What excites you?" She scoffed. "What excites me is truth. What excites me is not being silenced. What excites me is not being told by someone like you how I should behave in an interview." The audience gasped audibly. One of the other guests whispered something to the person next to them. Graham set down his note cards, a gesture that regular viewers knew meant things were getting serious. "I apologize if you feel I'm telling you how to behave," Graham said carefully. "That certainly wasn't my intention. I'm just trying to have a conversation. A conversation on your terms," she shot back. "A conversation where you control the narrative, where you decide what's acceptable to discuss and what isn't." "I've had enough of people trying to control me." Graham took a breath. "Nobody is trying to control you. You're welcome to discuss whatever you'd like. But I do think our audience came here to enjoy themselves, and perhaps we could find some common ground that everyone can engage with." She stood up suddenly, the movement so abrupt, it startled everyone. "Common ground? The common ground is that I've been mistreated. I've been lied about, and I've been expected to just accept it all with grace." "Well, I'm done with that." Graham remained seated, his expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Please, sit down. We can talk about this. No, Graham, I don't think we can, she said, her voice rising, because talking about it requires the other person to actually listen, to actually care about understanding rather than just getting their sound bites for tomorrow's headlines. The producer could be seen in the wings, speaking urgently into a headset. The camera operators didn't know where to point their lenses. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to react at all. Graham stood now too, his hands open in a placating gesture. I hear you. I genuinely do. And if I've done something to make you feel unheard, I apologize. But we can work through this. She shook her head vigorously. You don't hear me. None of day. You do. You hear what you want to hear. You see what you want to see. And then you judge based on those distortions. I promise you, that's not what's happening here, Graham insisted, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding. I have nothing but respect for you and your experiences. But shouting at me, at the audience, at the production team who worked hard to welcome you here tonight, that's not going to help anyone understand your perspective better. Her face flushed red. Don't you dare lecture me about respect. Don't you dare stand there and pretend you're the reasonable one when you invited me here knowing full well you'd try to sanitize everything I wanted to say. I invited you here to be yourself, Graham replied, and for the first time, there was a hint of frustration in his voice. And you're certainly doing that, but being yourself doesn't have to mean being hostile to everyone around you. She pointed a finger at him. Hostile? You think I'm being hostile? Try. Living my life for one day, Graham. Try facing what I've faced and then see how calm and collected you remain. I would never claim to know what you've been through, Graham said quietly. But I do know that right now, in this moment, you have a choice about how you want this to go. A choice, she repeated mockingly. That's rich. I haven't had real choices in years. Everything I do is scrutinized, criticized, picked apart by people who have never walked in my shoes. The other guests had now quietly stood and moved to the side of the stage, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the confrontation. The audience didn't know whether to clap, boo, or remain silent. Most chose silence. Graham tried once more. Then help us understand. Sit back down, take a breath, and help us understand what you're going through. That's all anyone wants. She laughed bitterly. No, what everyone wants is a spectacle. They want drama. They want tears. They want me to break down so they can feel better about their own lives. Well, I won't give you that satisfaction. Nobody wants to see you break down, Graham said firmly. What we want is to have a genuine conversation, but that requires both people to participate in good faith. Her eyes flashed with anger. Good faith? You're talking to me about good faith? After everything that's been printed about me, everything that's been said, all the lies and the manipulation, and you want to talk about good faith? Yes, I do, Graham replied. Because whatever happened before, whatever was said or done by others, I'm not those people. I'm standing here right now, trying to give you a platform to speak your truth, but you have to actually speak it rather than attacking everyone in the room. She grabbed her purse from beside the chair. I don't have to do anything. And I certainly don't have to sit here and be patronized by someone who thinks they're being magnanimous by giving me a few minutes of airtime. The audience began to murmur now, whispers spreading through the rows. Some people looked angry, others looked confused, a few looked sympathetic. Graham's expression remained remarkably composed given the circumstances. Nobody is patronizing you, he said. But I am asking you to consider that everyone here, from the crew to the audience to your fellow guests, they all came here tonight with good intentions. They came to see a show, to laugh, to learn something. They didn't come to be berated. She stepped toward him, her voice dropping to something almost menacing. You think you're so clever, don't you? With your little quips and your charm and your ability to make everyone love you. But you know what, Graham? Not everyone is impressed. Not everyone thinks you're wonderful. The other guests looked at each other in shock. This had gone from uncomfortable to completely unacceptable. Graham's face remained calm, but there was steel in his voice when he spoke. I never asked you to think I'm wonderful, he said. I asked you to be a guest on a talk show. And if you can't do that with basic courtesy, then perhaps this isn't the right place for you tonight. Her mouth opened in apparent outrage. Are you throwing me off your show? I'm saying that if you can't treat me, my staff, and this audience with respect, then yes, I think it's best if we end this now, Graham replied evenly. She looked around the studio as if expecting someone to come to her defense. Nobody moved. The silence was deafening. Fine, she spat. I don't need this circus anyway. I don't need your approval or your platform or any of it." She turned on her heel and began walking toward the exit. Graham called after her, his voice still maintaining that remarkable composure. "I'm sorry this didn't work out. I genuinely am." She spun back around one last time. "No, you're not. You're thrilled. You'll dine out on this story for months, won't you? The difficult guest who couldn't handle the great Graham?" "Norton, that's not how I see this at all," Graham said sadly. "I see someone who's clearly going through something difficult and who took it out on a room full of people who wished her nothing but well." Her final words before disappearing through the exit doors were sharp and cutting. "Keep telling yourself that, Graham, whatever helps you sleep at night." And then she was gone. The studio remained in stunned silence for several long seconds. Graham slowly turned back to face the audience, his expression carefully neutral. He walked to his desk, picked up his glass of water, took a sip, and then looked directly at the camera. "Well," he said quietly, "that was unexpected." The audience erupted. Some clapped, some gasped, some just sat there trying to process what they'd witnessed. The other guests slowly made their way back to the couch, their faces showing they were just as shocked as everyone else. Graham straightened his jacket and managed a small smile. "I think we might need a moment to regroup, don't you?" One of the other guests finally spoke. "Graham, I am so sorry. That was completely out of line." Graham waved a hand dismissively. "It's not your fault. Sometimes these things happen. People are complex. Situations are difficult. We'll move forward." But the audience could see that despite his professional handling of the situation, despite his grace under pressure, he had been affected by the exchange. There was a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a slight tremor in his hand as he set down his water glass. The show cut to commercial, but the damage was done. What was supposed to be a friendly, entertaining interview had devolved into a hostile confrontation that left everyone involved shaken. When they returned from break, Graham addressed the situation directly. "I want to apologize to everyone watching at home and to our wonderful audience here tonight. That's not the kind of show we normally do, and it's certainly not what any of us signed up for this evening." The audience applauded supportively, showing their solidarity with their beloved host. Graham nodded gratefully. "We have two wonderful guests still here with us," he continued, gesturing to the actors on the couch, "and I think they deserve a proper interview without all the drama. So let's talk about your new film, shall we?" The show continued, but the energy had changed. Everyone was trying their best to move past what had happened, but the ghost of that confrontation hung over the rest of the evening. Questions lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable. Graham, to his immense credit, carried on with professionalism and grace. He asked thoughtful questions. He laughed at the right moments. He gave his remaining guests the attention they deserved. But those who knew him well, who had watched his show for years, could see the toll it had taken. During another commercial break, he was seen speaking quietly with the producers, his brow furrowed in concern. This wasn't just about the spectacle of the moment. This was about someone who had come onto his show, into his space, and had treated him and everyone around him with contempt. The remaining guests did their best to lift the mood. They told funny stories, they plugged their projects, they tried to give the audience the show they'd come to see. And to their credit, it mostly worked. Laughter returned to the studio. The atmosphere slowly shifted from tense to merely awkward to almost normal. But nobody could forget what had happened. Nobody could unhear those sharp words, that bitter tone, the accusations flung without foundation or fairness. As the show drew to a close, Graham delivered his final remarks with characteristic warmth. "Thank you all so much for being such a wonderful audience tonight. I know it wasn't quite the evening we expected, but I appreciate you rolling with it." More applause, more support from the people who had witnessed the whole thing unfold. "We'll be back next week with more guests, more fun, and hopefully no unexpected exits," Graham added with a wry smile. "Until then, good night, everyone." The credits rolled. The audience filed out, already pulling out their phones to text friends and family about what they'd just witnessed. The other guests hugged Graham, offering words of support and sympathy. The crew began breaking down the set, their faces still showing signs of shock. And Graham Norton, one of the most respected and beloved hosts in television, sat alone at his desk for a moment, processing what had just occurred. He had handled it with grace, with professionalism, with every ounce of the skill and experience that had made him such a fixture on British television. But that didn't make it any easier to swallow. That didn't erase the sting of being attacked so personally, so publicly, by someone who had been welcomed as a guest into his show. The producers approached him carefully, offering reassurance, already planning how to handle the inevitable media fallout. But Graham just nodded, standing up and smoothing his jacket one more time. He had done nothing wrong. He had tried to be accommodating, tried to give his guests space to speak their truth, tried to navigate an increasingly hostile situation with kindness and respect. And in return, he had been vilified and attacked. As he walked off the stage, past the cameras and lights and all the equipment that made the magic of television possible, he carried himself with dignity. Because that's what Graham Norton did. That's who he was. Professional, gracious, and kind, even in the face of someone who showed him none of those qualities in return. The studio doors closed behind him, and the space that had just moments ago been filled with such drama and tension was now empty and quiet. The red chair sat alone on the stage, a silent witness to what had unfolded. 36 seconds, that's all it took from her first biting comment to the moment when the tone of the entire evening shifted irreversibly. 36 seconds where a guest revealed not their vulnerability or their pain, but their entitlement and their willingness to lash out at anyone within reach. And through it all, Graham Norton had remained the consummate professional, the good guy in a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. The host who tried everything in his power to salvage an interview that was determined to self-destruct. The lights in the studio began to dim, the stage slowly returning to darkness. But the impact of what had happened there that night would linger far longer than the bright lights and cameras. It would become one of those television moments that people would talk about for years to come, referenced and remembered not for the quality of the interview, but for the spectacular nature of its collapse. Graham Norton would go home that night knowing he had done everything right. He had been kind, patient, professional, and respectful. He had given his guest every opportunity to engage in a meaningful conversation. He had tried to de-escalate when things got heated. He had maintained his composure when confronted with hostility. And in doing so, he had shown exactly why he was so beloved, why audiences trusted him, why guests usually loved appearing on his show, why he had become such an institution in British entertainment. Because even when faced with someone determined to make him the villain, he refused to play that role. He remained exactly who he had always been. The entitled guest who stormed off his stage that night may have thought she was making a point, standing up for herself, refusing to be controlled. But what she actually did was demonstrate the difference between someone who commands respect through their actions and someone who demands it through their outrage. Graham Norton earned his reputation through years of kindness, wit, and genuine interest in his guests. He created a space where people felt comfortable being themselves, where conversations flowed naturally, where laughter came easily. That's not something that happens by accident. That's the result of someone who truly cares about the craft of hosting, who respects the people in front of and behind the camera. And no amount of hostility from one difficult guest could change that. If anything, it only highlighted it further, throwing into sharp relief the grace with which he handled an impossible situation. The story of that night would be told and retold, but the truth of it was simple. A beloved host welcomed a guest onto his show with open arms and good intentions. That guest chose to repay that welcome with contempt and accusations. And through it all, the host maintained his dignity and showed everyone watching exactly what true class looks like.